I wanted to make a brief announcement before starting today. Tomorrow, that is, on Saturday, May 11th, I'll be appearing on a live stream with some other guests on Mauritian Struggles channel. We'll be discussing the allegation of heresy against the Pope. A link to Mauritian Struggles channel is in the pinned comment in the comments section. It should be an interesting conversation, to say the least, so feel free to join us. It'll be at about 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Central, at least I think so. He's in the UK, and I'm not sure where exactly in the UK he is, but I think 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is about right. So check it out if you're so inclined. Yesterday, the Holy See released a Motu Proprio, or an edict to the Church, on the issue of sexual abuse and how to address it. And the timing of the release raised flags for those of us watching for a response to charges of heresy. But to be fair, a Motu Proprio does not get drafted in a handful of days. This document, called Vos Estis Lux Mundi, or You Are the Light of the World, had been in the works since the bishop's sex abuse seminar in February, and it provides the rule on how to appropriately deal with accusations of abuse perpetrated by clergy, or that's how it's being framed anyway. It has a fair amount of okay things in it, but there are some glaring issues that has left anyone paying attention saying that this is just a glorified case of more of the same being pushed by the Vatican. Let's have a look at the document in question. I'm not going to read the document verbatim, there's no real reason to do so. Much of the information for this video I'm pulling from the Vatican's official news release made through the Office of the Propaganda Minister for the current regime, Andrea Tornielli, over at Vatican News. The Motu Proprio implements several required action items for every corner of the Church, including the establishment of an office for reporting abuse in every diocese, with the obligation to report instances of abuse for every priest and religious in the Church. Note there's something missing there, which had previously been left to personal conscience, though this obligation to report is to, and I quote, to the competent ecclesiastical authority, end quote, meaning reporting to the bishop. You'll see more of this throughout. To continue, this document also requires that not only child abuse get reported, but abuse stemming from, quote, sexual abuse and violence resulting from an abuse of authority, end quote, which is clearly meant to cover the problem of seminarians being abused by priests, as well as the cases of nuns being sexually assaulted that we've all heard about. There are also the implementation of procedures to be used against bishops who implement cover-ups, which the document defines as, quote, actions or omissions intended to interfere with or avoid civil investigations or canonical investigations, whether administrative or penal, against a cleric or a religious regarding the delicts of sexual abuse, end quote. The Motu Proprio has specifically focused on the plight of vulnerable and disabled people who had been abused by priests, which must be an indirect reference to the abuse cases in South America and beyond, at a home for the disabled where abuse happened that is too horrifying to address here in any real way. Additionally, there is an emphasis on working with local law enforcement, saying that the law of the Church does not replace the obligation to cooperate with civil authorities on these investigations. However, that provision does not, it does not require the bishops or clergy to report abuse cases to law enforcement. This only requires that the bishops work with the local authorities should they somehow become involved. The protection of whistleblowers is interesting because we've heard stories detailing how whistleblowers would get marginalized, harassed, and intimidated by their peers and bishops in various dioceses. I'm going to quote that section of the Vatican press release in full. Quote, the sections dedicated to protecting those who come forward to report abuse are also significant. According to the revisions of the Motu Proprio, someone reporting abuse cannot be subjected to prejudice, retaliation, or discrimination because of what they report. The problem of victims who in the past have been told to keep silent is also addressed. These universal norms provide that an obligation to keep silent may not be imposed on any person with regard to the contents of his or her report. Obviously, the seal of confession remains absolute and inviolable and is in no way affected by this legislation. Vos Estis Lux Mundi also states that victims and their families must be treated with dignity and respect and must receive appropriate spiritual, medical, and psychological assistance. End quote. There are some provisions for investigating bishops, but the real meat of this document is this. This document places the authority for investigations squarely into the hands of the Metropolitan Bishop himself. There are provisions for bringing qualified laity into the investigation, but in the end, the investigations are done by the Metropolitan Bishop. If you don't understand why that's a horrible idea, picture this. former Cardinal McCarrick would have been in charge of investigating allegations made against his brother bishops and cardinals, and, from the looks of it, McCarrick's closest friends like Wuerl Bernardin and other known homosexualists would have been in charge of investigating the allegations made against him. See the problem with this? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. In the early stages of an investigation, the Metropolitan has the authority to unilaterally declare if the investigation is merited. If he finds the accusations unfounded, he's required to report this to a specific office in Rome, likely so a record of the abuse allegation is kept somewhere for the future. Critics ranging from Church Militant to the folks at Bishop Accountability and others are calling the document insufficient, noting how it bears a rather strange similarity to the Wuerl proposal heavily promoted by Cardinal Cupich at the failed bishops' meeting in Maryland this past November. That plan also proposed placing sex abuse investigations of fellow bishops under the auspices of the Metropolitan. In case you wonder what Cardinal Wuerl has been up to since his resignation last fall, now you know. The Motu Proprio breaks from the Wuerl-Cupich plan in that it includes mechanisms for vulnerable adults, meaning seminarians, junior priests, religious, and adults under the care of the church. But again, they must report allegations to the Metropolitan. What do they do if the Metropolitan is the alleged abuser? Hello, Ted McCarrick. Finally, this document does nothing, and I do mean nothing, to address the underlying cause of the crisis, the presence of a staggering amount of homosexuals in the priesthood, be they regular priests or bishops. Omitted from this document are consensual sex acts performed between adults, including priests, as well as the use or even production of otherwise legal pornography by priests and seminarians, which has been a big problem in the Church in the West and remains so today. In other words, this Motu Proprio both enables the bishops to maintain absolute control in an area that they have already failed spectacularly at, while in the past doing nothing to address the crisis of impurity and the crisis of perversion in the priesthood. But did we expect anything else? What we see in this document amounts to procedural changes at best. Little meaningful changes are made to address the problem of rampant abuse in the Church at the hands of priests and the cover-up that always ensues. Much of the problem is the bishop, who covers up these problems either because he is afraid of what will come if he investigates the issue, takes meaningful action, or he is afraid because of the consequences of working with law enforcement proactively. Or because, often enough, the bishops are not only abusers themselves, but also co-conspirators in the cover-up of the institutionalization of turning the priesthood into a gay profession. If you remember, some seminaries in the U.S. and abroad earned nicknames like the Pink Palace because they were filled to the brim with homosexuals, with any non-pervert in those schools either being drummed out for a variety of technical issues or often enough preyed upon by his peers. There was the case of American bishops actively funneling gay seminarians from South America into several seminaries in the U.S., which practically states that at least for a time, the bishop actively wanted to turn the priesthood gay. If you think that's provocative, take a good hard look at McCarrick and the men around him like Tobin, Cupich, Wuerl, and Bishop Wilton Gregory of Atlanta, among others. You'll see the same pattern emerge there as elsewhere. This Motu Proprio is largely a mess. It will do little to address the issues of the corruption of the hierarchy. That is a travesty. The future cases of abuse that come because no meaningful action was taken to address the abuse of power of the bishops, in these cases will be on the hands and consciousness of those most responsible for this Motu Proprio, which certainly includes Wuerl and Cupich as well as Pope Francis. What can we do? Well, you have to continue to pray for the Church, but also encourage abuse survivors to go to the secular authorities first. Then, after an official police report has been filed, and only then, report this to the Chancery Office, especially if the allegation involves the bishop, since the bishop would most certainly be in charge of investigating himself. And if that sounds provocative again, that's just the state of things right now in the Church. Thank you for listening and for your support. If you want to support my work, there are options in the description of this video. I ask that people continue to pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Viva Cristo Rey.